and our children. Today, I have a guest that I'm really excited for you to meet. Been a friend of mine for a few years now, Andy Duran. He is the CEO of LEAD, Linking Efforts Against Drugs, based out of Lake Forest, Illinois. He's a prevention professional. I know I've learned a tremendous amount from him, and he's such a huge asset, not just to the Illinois prevention community, but also honestly nationally. He talks all over the country, and his passion shows through all the time. So that being said, Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Weiner. Good to see you.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit before we dive into questions for today? What are you working on? What are your initiatives right now?
Sure. Yeah. Not surprisingly, we've been really busy. I know we're going to get into some of this later, but the pandemic in the past year has certainly led to a big increase in mental health and the related disorder, things that come with that, like substance use. So we have been still working in schools and talking with young people. We're still trying to help communities, create safer communities for youth, and of course, we still have our text to tip 24/7 text line. But we have been busier than ever before, just differently so.
Yeah. So what Andy's talking about, LEAD was, were you the guy, did you do the whole text to tip thing yourself, or were you partnering on that?
Yeah, no, we started that program back in 2014 initially, in response to some suicides we had in our community. So it was our team that built that.
It's a tremendous resource that allows 24/7 folks to text a tip, quite literally, if someone's struggling or having a hard time or at risk of suicide, behavioral health, substance use, and actually get connected with a therapist in the community. So right. Tremendously helpful. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. And the topic of youth drug prevention is critically important. Last week was actually the CADCA conference, the conference where prevention professionals from across the country would normally gather in DC. It was done virtually this year. I had the pleasure of talking to, I think it was 5 different elected officials over the course of the week, both political parties. Everyone was extremely passionate about this and extremely supportive about this. And I know even if it's not, we'll call it the normal experience of seeing people in person and having that kind of like that community push forward, it was still really energizing to see how much support there is from this. For this. But that said, so our first question for today, let's start broad, which is what right now is the emotional climate amongst teenagers, or call it junior high school and high school, in terms of what they're dealing with and how they're coping with it?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big question. I think that even pre-pandemic, even before, schools and communities started shutting down and people started getting anxious about, job loss and sickness and things like that, we were seeing an increase, and I'm sure you were too, in just teens reporting anxiety, mental health issues, depression, substance use, and all the related things, right? And we think about in a community like where we're based and communities that we operate in, one of the reasons for that is that I don't know if there's more of it now than there ever has been, or if people are more comfortable talking about it. But I do think the reduction in stigma and, the ability to have, even while it's still not perfect, at least some increased access to treatment services has helped people realize that it's okay to seek out help when needed. So, when I think about when I first came to LEAD, 8 years ago, when we first started Text to Tip 6 years ago, we've seen a big change in communities in that time in terms of the number of teens reaching out for help. And I guess the bigger question is it because we live in a more stressful world, minus the last 12 months? Because the answer to that is absolutely yes, for the past 11 to 12 months. But prior to that, or is it that people are more comfortable talking about it because communities have done a better job supporting it? And I think it's some of both, actually. I don't know what your experience has been, but definitely, I think we've got teens, who are nervous about lots of things. They're nervous about what's going to be the next phase of their life. They're nervous about, their parents and illness. They're nervous about, their own relationships and how, given this isolation, how they're going to come out on the other side of it. So I think there's a lot of things at play there.
Yeah. Well, and so what's your take on resilience amongst kids right now as well? Because when we think of why do young people gravitate towards substances, which is, of course, where your focus is, a lot of it has to do with coping. So there's certainly a really strong arm of it around social issues and that whole side of things as well. But the coping and dealing with those internal states is huge.
Yeah, for sure. I think teens, just like adults, the same reasons that, you or I or any other adult might use after a long day or something, or have a drink or whatever. Teens pick up on that stuff and the things they've been conditioned to over time. So I think, yes, while there are other things at play, I think certainly coping is a big piece of that. And, one thing we try to do is help students understand that there are more natural, healthier ways to do that. And to highlight the fact that, if you drink or vape or smoke pot or use some substance to cope or to pull you out of something that you're feeling, from a short-term perspective, that will work. I think part of the job that we have as adults in the community is to acknowledge that, you feel these things, and this will make you temporarily maybe not feel that to the same degree. However, that's not without long-term consequence. And what actually happens is trying to help a young person understand that making the decision now to cope and have a short-term relief actually leads to that issue being exacerbated more intermediate and long term. And I think, that's a hard thing to communicate, but actually trying our best to communicate those things, environmentally in our communities is a huge piece of the work that we try to do every day.
Yeah, it reminds me of that classic marshmallow test study, right? Where
Yes.
you get the marshmallow in front of you, and you have the promise of 2 marshmallows later if you cannot eat it. It's really hard to resist the marshmallows, even if you're an adult.
That's right, for sure. Yeah, there's instant gratification right there, and it's hard to see beyond that sometimes. I think we all find ourselves in this situation sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, I know that I was actually really impressed because this didn't happen to me when I was a kid, but my daughter, this was, so she's in 1st grade right now. So this must've been when she was in kindergarten, but she was telling us one day about how the teachers had actually been teaching different breathing techniques for de-escalation for the kids, like candle breath and rainbow breath and cupcake breath. And they were basically all these different ways of doing controlled deep breathing the kids could do when they needed to calm down. And I was just blown away by that. I don't know why we don't do more of that as kids get older, with maybe slightly more in-depth techniques, but.
Well, and I think that schools and teachers have gotten smarter about identification when students might need that, and providing some coping strategies at a young age. Because you think about what we teach our kids when they're in our home. We teach them to avoid certain dangers. We cover electrical outlets, and we talk about some of those things. But sometimes, we weren't conditioned when we were kids, probably, and neither of you or I are that old. but we weren't conditioned to be able to recognize within ourselves or our peers, or to talk about kind of mental health related issues, and therefore we're never taught how to cope with it, right? So I think that we've smartened up as communities and as schools to know how to identify that, to help to validate it, to help students self-identify that, and then to provide some coping techniques. So hopefully by the time that your 1st grader and my young kids who are slightly older than yours get to middle school and high school, they've got other ways to cope because they've been taught. And I think that's a big difference in generation of parenting, that and where the world is, that hopefully our teens will be better equipped to be resilient and to find other positive things.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of what kids are taught, so one of the hardest parts about helping children right now, helping young people, is messaging to them, because it's very easy to dismiss your parents as being out of touch or not woke or not really knowing what's going on because you're not the one doing it. So how could you know? One of the core techniques that you have as a preventionist is the ability to reach young people. So what do we need to know in terms of the strategies that actually allow you to cut through?
I think there are a lot of things, and unfortunately, they're not easy. Some of them are not easy and require a change within us as parents and as leaders too. So, one of the things is, I think, in terms of messaging, I think sometimes we think about just what we tell our kids, but more than that, it's what we tell and show, right? So, if we think about our own language and behavior, and we can all put ourselves in these situations, right? This has been a tough year, maybe the toughest year to be a parent, regardless of your kid's age, in probably the past 100 years, maybe even beyond, right? You think about, you're trying to juggle work, you're trying to juggle, your kids' school lives while they're at home. You're trying to juggle keeping your business open. You're trying to stay healthy. You're trying to make sure your parents are staying healthy and that they get immunized. There's so many different stressors that we wouldn't have even thought of a year ago. So it's easy to say for us, like, oh my gosh, it's been a long day. I can't wait to have that glass of wine. And there's nothing wrong inherently as an adult, thinking that or wanting to engage in that. If we drink, responsibly, it's that can be a protective factor for youth. But what we, I think, get wrong as parents sometimes is that we link the behavior with what we're feeling. So, if we're saying, I got to have a glass of wine, it's not about the glass of wine. It's not like, you sit down and have a glass of wine with dinner. That's a negative thing. That's not what we say. But it's linking that need for that with what you've felt during the day. And I think so looking at our own language and behavior around those things can, make a big difference in how our teens, how our kids grow up being conditioned to those things. So I've got a list of things that go into messaging, but I'll sort of stop and because I know you've got a lot to say about this too.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear more about that. And if there's any resources or something on like the LEAD website, I would love to hear that as well. And I should mention, because I didn't mention this at the top, if viewers, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat. We can see it over here. We'll make sure we get to ask Andy before our time is up today. But I know that, one of the things that's really apparent when kids are very young, but really doesn't ever change, is that they're like sponges and they're always watching. They're always watching you as a parent. You are so impactful on their development. And I think that it's easy once, they're not learning language and doing all those earlier things to not realize, hey, if I'm drinking at the end of every day or even a lot of days, and that's how I relax, then my kids are going to think that's how I should relax.
That's how you relax, right? And and I think that it's part of it is kind of what we communicate by our own actions and how we link those behaviors with the rest of our lives, right? And I think you're right. Kids at a young age pick up on that. I think also making sure that we're talking early and often. So I know your kids are young, Aaron. Mine are young too, 5th grade and 3rd grade, and I'm probably guilty of talking, my wife and I, too much about it. Me is doing what I do. My wife is a social worker. I think that we understand that the need to talk to our kids is pretty great, and to repeat that over and over and over and over again, and to start young. I think there's 2 things I hear from parents related to this. And the first one is, when's the right time to start talking to my kid? I should wait until they, know what this stuff is, or wait till they're exposed. My argument and what research shows is that's too late. You should start now. Just find an age appropriate way to do it, right? The other thing I hear is that, I talk to my kids about that, 6th or 7th grade, they know what I think. So they got the message. I'm like, not if the message stopped, right? This is one of those things that you got to repeat over and over and over again. And I think when you are doing that, to make sure we're communicating our disapproval, because the number one reason still, even though, some people think that, if I tell my teen not to do something, they're going to be more likely to do it. There are outliers, and there are teens where that's the case. You may or may, if you're listening, you may have a teen that's like that. But the majority of teens aren't like that. The majority of teens, the number one reason teens who have not had a drink of alcohol in the past 30 days, this is looking at both Lake County data in Illinois, Cook County data in Illinois, as well as just nationally, is because their parents would strongly or very strongly disapprove. And I think that's really, really important to know, that your teen is significantly less likely to have engaged in alcohol use, and therefore, oftentimes other drug use, if you've communicated your disapproval. And I think that's a hugely powerful message and powerful tool that we have as parents that sometimes we forget is in our toolbox.
Mm-hmm. So as a parent, if you're trying to communicate disapproval, how do you navigate issues where maybe your child's already engaged in that behavior? How do you separate the person from the behavior when you're communicating that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think sometimes that, it's important that we avoid scare tactics. The easy thing to do is to say, if you drink, you're going to get arrested, or you're going to, get in a car accident, or I've heard all those things, right? And can that happen? Sure, can happen, right? But teens know that 90% or more of the time that doesn't happen. So, avoiding scare tactics, and there's all kinds of research on this. We actually have information on our website about this. Happy to also, if you contact me, happy to send it to you directly. But all kinds of research that shows actually scare tactics work great with adults. So if you want to, talk to, if we're talking to adults about the reasons your kid shouldn't drink, scare tactics generally work. With teens, though, it oftentimes backfires, and it's not a reason that young people make decisions. Because think about yourself as a teen. I think about me as a teen. I thought I was invincible. I wasn't afraid to jump on a trampoline and try to hop over the very tall fence. Now it's icy outside, and I'm grabbing onto everything I can to not fall down. At some point, we start realizing that bad things can occur, but teens oftentimes don't get it. So we have to find ways to help them to understand that the positives for non-use significantly outweigh any of the consequences of using, right? We have to be aware of the consequences, but that's not our primary decision point in the messaging, because that's not the way teens respond. So, aligning them with helping to identify, what are those positive reasons why you could choose not to use, and what would be the outcomes of that, versus looking at the negative and focusing on those positives makes a big difference.
So something that I've used sometimes when speaking about vaping, I'd love to get your feeling on this, is that I try to use a hook of really emphasizing that kids are being used, that there are these vaping companies that are intentionally trying to manipulate them, that are using tactics that have been used literally for decades, but they're being reinvented, and that young people are basically being used like cash cows because they think that they're stupid. And what I've found is that when I lead with that, which is of course 100% true, it's not like I'm lying about that. That immediately perks up kids' ears who might otherwise not have been listening or would be discounting some of the health aspects, which I then go into, back when I was doing assemblies before COVID. So it's not exactly a scare tactic, but it is something that's trying to provoke an emotion. Have you ever used that sort of technique?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, one of the next things on my list was to point out the injustices, meaning how vaping industry is targeted teens. So we're on the same page there, Aaron, and so if you think about what really drives young people, and this is one thing I love about teens, by the way, I spent most of my career working with teens in some capacity or another. And it's one thing that really gives me energy every time I'm in a classroom or in a gym for an assembly or something, or even one-on-one, is their passion for the world and their passion for justice in general. I mean, way more than we do. I mean, there's passion for all kinds of social justices that teens have and actively work in. And especially, and I don't mean this to sound negative, I mean it to be a positive, especially when they are the ones who are being the injustice, so like, and when you say, this is how the industry works, and you can put vaping industry in that. To some extent, you can put the marijuana industry in that, the tobacco industry years ago. I mean, this is the playbook, right? This is it. There is a reason that many, many young people 2 years ago got into vaping when Juul came on the market and hit and targeted young people, right? And when you point those things out, now I wouldn't even call that a scare tactic, because that's actually legitimately what happened, right? This is just telling the truth about what has happened. So I think that absolutely can make a big difference. And I think another thing that we, kind of related, that's not a scare tactic but can be true, is if we have a family history, if there's a family history of some sort of alcoholism or drug use or substance use or addiction, it's helpful that a teen knows that, because that can factor into their decision making, to not avoid that conversation. I think sometimes the tendency is I don't want my son or daughter to know that, because it's sort of maybe it's some dark times, within the family, but making sure they understand that might be something they need to be aware of, because we know that can be genetic. So just telling the truth about all those things, I think is and being open and honest generally has better outcomes.
Yeah. Even within some like invincibility complexes, I think that there's an acknowledgement that like risk might be out there, even if we don't want to think about it. Like, but I know that like, certainly I'm sure that I was right along there with all the rest of the college students who would not look whenever I was crossing roads or whatever, like when I was a kid. But at the same time there, if someone told me like, hey, this is a real risk for you based on these things that you've seen with your own eyes, that would be impactful on me.
Right. And, when you think about scared, like one of the things that stopped, we're still in it, but I mean, that was started to curb some of the teen vaping that we saw was when EVALI, the electronic vaping and associated lung injury illness came out. And that was linked to actual chemicals and actual substances that were in some of the products, the most popular products that teens were using. So there is some extent where when you share a public health fact, that it can have an impact. And of course, then communities and schools and whatnot got smarter in that, and some laws and ordinances were put in place that helped as well. But and I think that just making sure that we're telling the truth about those things and not exaggerating, not jumping to the far end of the spectrum, not saying anything that's untrue, because we'll be called on that. And I'll say one other thing that I think parents have in their toolbox. I talked about, you have this great message in your toolbox that's, we're going to set the expectation that you're not going to drink, and we're not okay with that. Another one is that, I hear is like, your teens might ask you, did you drink in high school or college? And I've had a lot of parents ask the question. And first of all, you probably already know this by just having me listen to me talk. I'm not a parenting expert, right? I never claimed to be one. Like I thought potty training is the hardest thing I'd ever go through. And I know that when you have teens, it gets way harder. So I'm not here to tell anybody how to parent. One thing I can do is tell you about other experiences I've heard people have had and to tell you what the research says. But one thing I think you have at your disposal is if you're talking about your own, history with these things and your own behavior in high school or college, or when you were their age, is to be truthful about it. Because some parents will think, well, if I tell them that I smoked pot in college, they're going to want to smoke pot and then throw that in my face and say, well, you did it. Why can't I? Well, here's two things about that. One is I think we all want something better for our kids than we had, right? Even we could have had a great, perfect childhood growing up, but we all want something better for our kids. So you can easily say, yeah, I did this. I didn't have anybody that was telling me not to, and I want something better for you. And if you think it's going to be because, if you think your teen's going to say, well, you smoked pot and you turned out fine, your teens don't think you turned out fine, so use that to your advantage. Say, did I really turn out okay? Do you really want to be like me? So use that. Now with a younger kid, that's not going to work. But when they get to be, junior high school, that is something that will absolutely work. Well, no, I don't, so I think that's something you have in your toolbox too, that sometimes we're afraid to pull out, but I think that can actually have a benefit.
Have you seen the clothes that I'm wearing? Have you seen how much you want me around when you're hanging out with your friends?
Exactly. Right.
Did I turn out okay? Really? Yeah. No, that's a good take on it. And it's a legitimately tough question though. There are a lot of those kind of like conversational landmines that I think are really challenging for parents to handle, and that's definitely one of them. While we're on the topic of vaping, I'll mention that. And scare tactics, I guess, for that along those lines too. I know with marijuana in particular, and we're going to talk about marijuana again a little bit later in the show. But one of the issues about scare tactics is there's some legitimately scary aspects about it for kids. Like there was just a study I was made aware of today. It just came out a couple of days ago, where let me see here. So what they found was that kids with cannabis use disorder, as opposed to not, had their risk for self-harm was 3 times higher. Their all-cause mortality was 59% higher. Unintentional overdose with other substances was 2.5 times higher. And homicide was 3 times higher for those who had a diagnosed marijuana use disorder, independent of everything else. And like you say that sort of stuff, and it's the sort of thing that kids might really react to and be like, oh, you don't mean that. Or there's some other studies that were really impactful on me as a psychologist that found that even a single time of use can have a structural change on the brain, much less repeated use with high potency product, which is of course all there is out there these days. And I actually find myself sometimes shying away from the truth and like not sharing the most alarming data with kids because I'm worried about that backlash of to actually hearing that's like too scary.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that gets to be a point, and it's hard to walk that balance, and it's different for everybody. So, in your case, clinically, you might be working one-on-one with a student, and over the course of time, you've gotten to know them, and you'll know kind of, through work with them, or if you're their parents, you'll know kind of where you've hit that right balance of telling the stories, but not stretching it to like it's the far other side of the spectrum where you're just trying to scare them into non-use. It's universally from a community perspective, or from going in to talk to 1,000 students in a school, that's much more complicated. So sending more of a middle of the road message is important. While I understand they have the right facts, but not sharing, it's sort of like a magician, right? So everybody thinks and knows that the rule of a magician is that, when he or she does a trick, and you ask how they do it, do they ever tell you? Like, no, they don't tell you how to do their trick. Generally, that's only part of it, though. I mean, I was actually at a conference and spoke with a magician one time and asked, show me some of these tricks. We're stuck in an airport. Can you show me some of these tricks? And much to my surprise, he showed me everything. And you think I remembered anything? I remembered literally nothing. So it's like they either don't tell you anything, or they tell you so much that you remember nothing. And that's what I remember, like going through DARE as a kid, which we know has been proven to be ineffective, and why that's not what we do at LEAD. But they taught us literally how to shoot up. Taught us what things looked like and what a syringe was and all this, and taught us the wrong stuff, but also like so much stuff that you just can't remember anything. So I think that walking that balance of sharing the right information in the right ways, that's age appropriate and repeated over time. And making sure that, it's things that when they're in the moment of having to make a decision, when they're in that moment of that transition point where you can go down fork in the road, you can go one way or the other way. What is it they're going to remember that's going to make them choose that healthier path, right? And I think part of that, and I don't know if you've seen this in your work, Aaron, but part of that is just like we have to be okay, both as parents and encourage our kids to just let other people's feelings go. Like, my kids, it's not about substance use, but it's about, we're pretty careful as a family about COVID. We have really, really kind of kept to ourselves and canceled vacations and not seeing anybody. And that's been really hard because we have a pretty big social circle. And some of our kids' friends are not like that. So, it's hard for our young kids to understand why we're doing that, but we've got to let other people's feelings go. Same thing as with substance use. There's, you may have teens and you have good friends who let their kids drink, and you say, maybe, what's the big deal? I don't want my friend to get mad. I don't want my kids' friends to get mad at them. But I think at some point when we start to let other people's feelings go and just do what's right for ourselves, and we teach our teens how to respond that way, that makes a big difference as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that concept applies, that resonates up and down the lifespan. I'd say that a lot of the work that I do with folks in therapy has to do with being okay with yourself, or not just going along with what other people want, or using other people's opinions about you as proxies for your own, as opposed to really having a really strong sense of self. Right. But I want to pivot for a second to another topic that you and I will actually be collaborating on in a couple of weeks, which is for our presentation on how media influences kids in terms of their perception of risk and of drug use. We're collaborating on a webinar called, I think we're calling it Teens and Screens, and we're looking at how things like Euphoria, for example, it's a show on HBO. I actually hadn't watched it until recently, and let me tell you, after watching the pilot, I was horrified at the idea that a child would watch this show. Probably one just in general. It's a very intense show with a lot of very intense sexual and drug-related themes, just in general, but certainly without context. But two, although as the show went along, there was definitely a lot more balance in terms of showing it as not necessarily just like an overly glamorized useful thing, but it really did the element of normalcy behind things like sexting, sex during high school, doing drugs, drinking all the time. It just seemed, that idea that this is just kind of par for the course in high school never really faded. Like all the characters just kind of take it in stride, even if there are negative aspects that are highlighted and it's not really shown as a positive thing. How do you feel about the connection? There's always this debate of which comes first, society or media, right? Does media shape the way people act, or is media just reflecting real life? How do you what's your take on how you work with kids around this, if, say, they are watching TVMA shows like Euphoria?
Yeah, it's amazing how much that has, first of all, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that as a parent, which is what makes it complicated, right? I think that if you think about like when we were kids, Aaron, and my parents were really horrified by The Simpsons, and
yes, too.
and then when Melrose Place came on and all my friends started, I was like, oh my gosh, like, so, and we think about now how innocuous that actually is compared to, and maybe my parents were really conservative, I don't know, but boy, it's changed. And you're right, you watch some of the shows that are popular now, and they're hard to watch as adults sometimes. And I don't consider myself a teetotaler. I don't consider myself really that much of a prude or that conservative. But still, your perception of these things does change when you have kids. I think something happens ontologically where you have kids, and all of a sudden your perception of things changes. But I do think that watching these things in and of themselves, any sort of exposure or normalization can be harmful, right? But actually, I think there's opportunity for learning and discussion there too. I think what makes it complicated is when there's no context and when there's no support. So if a teen is just like binging Euphoria on his or her own late at nights, on school nights or weekends, that's one thing. if they really want to watch it and you're watching it with them and you're processing and discussing and talking about your own values and tradition, that's a whole nother thing, right? So I know some parents have really effectively said, okay, you can watch this show, that's fine. We're going to watch it together. And that may be one of two things. One, they may just say, no, thanks, don't want to watch that with you, and move on to something else. Or two, we'll say, okay, great, I want to watch it, and let's do that. Now, you'll also have some teens that will just watch it anyway with that, and that you got to deal with how to do that within your family dynamic. But I think making sure that we acknowledge these things are out there, use them as learning opportunities. Like, what does Euphoria tell us about substance use? What does the Queen's Gambit tell us about the need for this in order to succeed? And even beyond that, think about athletes. What do you think about steroid scandal in baseball? Back in the early 2000s. What is this telling us I was a young athlete, what does this tell us that, if I want to be at the next level, the guys who are making it to the next level, many of them were juicing, so it's like you can choose almost when you're young to not do that and have this perception of being less successful, or choosing to do that and have there's this perception that you're more successful. We know that's actually not true, but as a young person, that's sort of how you process it. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are these things that are out there. And to some extent, I think exposure to some of this stuff with the right context is a protective factor. But there's other parts of it that are just so out there that it's just not healthy to see. So yeah, I mean, I'd love you're more of an expert in this area than me, that's for sure. So I'm looking forward to what you found on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so what's interesting about this, and so in the webinar, we'll be talking about things like Euphoria, Queen's Gambit, and then some that are a little bit more passive in terms of drug use, like Stranger Things. And we can talk more about the sort of more passive smoking and tobacco use in a minute. But I think that, I mean, what's interesting about it, what it reminds me of a bit is when back in the debate where the question was, should kids be playing violent video games, right? And there was this back when like Columbine happened and back when the school shootings really started, just started really happening more. There's this question of, well, are we training kids to be school shooters by having them play these violent video games or first-person shooters? And one of the, I remember looking at studies of this back when I was an undergrad in college, and one of the findings that kept coming out was that most kids can tell the difference between fantasy and reality. And so they're not, they aren't actually being desensitized to real world violence by doing things virtually on a screen. But for those who cannot, for those who are really struggling with that boundary, particularly even those who have some underlying mental illness, that's when you might have more issues with that. And that principle is what's coming to mind right now with these sorts of shows where, someone might look at that and say, I want to fit in, I want to be cool. And they might not realize, one, it is a caricature of reality, not even reality, it's like a dystopian high school reality in many ways. But not only that, but actually all the actors, when they filmed it, were over 20. That's why you can have all this explicit nudity and sex and all this sort of stuff. Otherwise, I mean, it clearly wouldn't be legal. Right. But I guess that's really what I'm concerned most about, is that those who are not feeling very anchored in their identity and in their reality see this and say, like, that looks interesting. That looks like they've got groups of friends. They've got stuff going on that I want that, even if it is unhealthy.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is systemically, like, much of that's just been okay. So I think it still works this way. If you're under 21 in Illinois, you can't buy legally a vape, right? If you're under 17, you can't buy a ticket. I think that's still true. You can't buy a ticket to a rated R movie, right? But there aren't any of those age verification things for some of these shows. Now, if you're a savvy parent, you can figure out ways to screen some of that out of their options and things like that. But it is it's important to know that there's just this open access to things that didn't exist when we were kids. It actually didn't even exist to some extent 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Like, I remember when Netflix went from, being able to, they'd ship you a couple DVDs a week and you ship them back, you get your next ones. I mean, now it's just everything they have is, you can anytime.
I watched the entire series of House MD that way. It was fantastic.
There you go. Yeah. And there's just one, and now it's like, it's immediate, and it doesn't be, you can have a kid's profile, but like, let's say that you have a teen who's 16 years old and you're okay with them watching The Office, but you're not okay with them watching Euphoria. I know those are on two different streaming platforms, but whatever. I think that, it's really hard to monitor that as a parent. So we have to some extent, trust our education of our kids, trust the relationship we have with them, because we've talked early and often about our expectations and our traditions, and then expect that your kids will make the right choice. Because the reality is, and I think it's true with anything, if we expect our young people to make the wrong choice, then they're more likely to. If we say, well, kids are just going to drink because they're kids, or they're just going to smoke pot because there's pot shops now and everybody's doing it, then that's probably more likely the road they're going to go down. But if we are able to say as a parent, or as a community leader, or as their physician, or as their coach, or as their teacher, whomever it might be, that, no, I expect that you can make the right choice, and here are the reasons why, and here's why that's important, then they're going to be much more likely to do that, right? So I think that it just goes back into how we frame any of these sort of healthy versus risky decisions that teens have, multiple times throughout their childhood and adolescence, is, setting the right expectations, and not being complicit when they go down the path that's wrong.
Yeah, and I'd almost add, as we were talking about this, an element that could be useful is being proactive, being aware of the media landscape and trying to be proactive about it. Because even if, for example, you do have parental controls set up and, so on and so forth, that doesn't mean that all their friends will. And, so many phones and iPads and media devices, like if they want to go consume this content, they will. And so even if we might not necessarily want to have certain conversations or be talking about certain shows, or maybe not even watch it. I mean, I think I would be uncomfortable watching Euphoria with my children at any age. It's just a very explicit show. Right. I think we still have to talk about it, because if we don't, there's a good chance they're going to come in contact with it anyway, and then they lack that context.
Well, that's right. And who do you want them getting the message from, you or somebody else? Right. And I think that's it. If the reality is that they're going to come across these things, I would think in most cases want that message coming from you, rather than their peers, or rather than, some other adult that you may not trust, so I think that's in order to control kind of that context, it does make sense to not avoid all this stuff and to talk about it when it's appropriate, for sure.
So the other aspect of it, and we alluded to this a little bit a minute ago, has to do maybe even less with the explicit glamorization of either substance use or a substance use lifestyle, and just it being embedded in what you're watching. So I found it fascinating to read about what happened with Stranger Things. So for those who are not aware, so that's a very popular show on Netflix. That actually over the 3 seasons of the show has seen escalating amounts of smoking just on screen by characters, not necessarily glamorizing it in any way, but happening a lot more actually than most other shows on TV right now, streaming or otherwise. And what was very interesting about this was that there was a study done by the Truth Initiative that found that kids who watched shows that had smoking or vaping content in it were far more likely to be smoking or vaping themselves, that they were referencing this. And even watching someone smoke was associated with a higher chance of them starting vaping. And to me, one, it was interesting to see how it just soaks in, how the eyes are always open, and how this normalization really affects youth. But two, and this actually is to their credit, Netflix actually responded to this and said that in future seasons, they'd vastly be cutting down on smoking in all their shows, but particularly in Stranger Things. And they actually added smoking as one of the labels now on all their shows that include smoking by the characters, like along with gore and like explicit content. It just says smoking. And I was actually really impressed by that. But
yeah, I didn't know that. I'm impressed by that too. And I'm glad to hear that happened. So somebody somewhere advocated for that, which goes into like, what can we do about this? And that's one of those things. That's really interesting. Yeah, I had not heard that.
Yeah, but I think it really just shows how prevention absolutely matters, and how sometimes it's these, sometimes we think about the most impactful news stories being like these exposés that cause like a senator to resign, or, like that it's all political, but actually you can publish a scientific study that has immediate impact if the industry in question is a good player. And that's not always the case. Certainly in the substance use world, we see that a lot, but yeah, I mean, just take the smoking out and immediately you've got a positive impact when you got millions of kids watching your show.
Well, and that goes too is, one thing that we know is that there are certain triggers, it's why, like if just even take something outside of substance use for a minute, just to kind of bring home the point, think about problem gambling. I remember seeing I forget what state I was in, but I remember seeing a problem, I think it was Florida, a problem gambling flyer. And on the top of the flyer was, having problem gambling. It was about treatment for that, but it was a big slot machine on the cover. And the first thing I'm thinking as a prevention is like, there's a trigger for somebody who your target audience, right? So it's very much like that. If you have a teen who's kind of dabbled in some of this use and then they see it, in a show, that can be a trigger. If you have a teen who has never dabbled in use nor really even thought about it, it's not as much of a trigger. So it's also, like what do we know about what influences use and how do we mitigate and minimize that, especially in a targeted, more indicated population?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I want to talk specifically in a second about things that parents can do. But before we get there, I also want to touch on marijuana from a youth prevention point of view, because you are intimately connected to this topic. We just talked a second ago about the recent study that just came out about how it could, in more ways that it negatively impacts young people. But that is one of the biggest gaps, I think. One of the biggest issues that young people have to overcome right now about marijuana is a tremendous mountain of misinformation, where you've got what they hear from their peers and honestly their parents and even politicians sometimes, versus what we know from medical research, what we know from state publications, the huge discrepancy. So what are you seeing right now around youth in the subject, and what's the path forward here for us, particularly in places like Illinois where we have recreational marijuana?
Right. And I think you hit it on the head, is that there's a lot of misinformation, and that's part of the playbook. I think you and I both know that. You think back, this is big tobacco 2.0 and maybe 3.0, right? I mean, this is, if you look at the playbook for tobacco, back in the 50s and 60s, even prior to that, and you look at the advertisements and the way they hit the market, the way the teens were targeted and all that. I mean, this is exactly what's we saw with vaping. It's not what we see with the big marijuana industry. So this is 2.0. It's all about big business. It's not about medicine. It's not about anything but that. And I think, you and I, who have done a lot of work on this, Dr. Weiner, have studied the impact in other states and other communities, who have forecasted what we should expect here in our own home state, are certainly very concerned about that, because you're right. It's not just that teens are getting misinformation, which is more easy to correct. It's that adults in communities have gotten misinformation. It's that not just some politicians, I would venture to say most have gotten, at least most of the ones I've talked to in the state, have gotten the wrong information. And because of that, that we're on the wrong side of the social norms now, which flipped like that, and I think about 10 years ago, how it was becoming more normalized, but it wasn't fully normalized. Now it's like you're in the minority if you A, aren't doing it, and B, are against it in any way, shape, or form, to try to keep it. And some of that is like, the legalization industry has redefined the whole market. They branded marijuana as being a medicine, and we fed into it by calling it medical marijuana, right? Which we don't. I just did here to prove a point, but we actually try not to do in our organization, especially when we're talking to kids. Marijuana is marijuana. It's water's water. I can call one medicine if I want, because it does alleviate symptoms of thirst and other things, but it doesn't make it a medicine, right? So I think the fact that there's just been so much misinformation about, the fact, well, the legalized stuff isn't as harmful because it's not addictive and because it's regulated. I'm like, no, marijuana is marijuana. In fact, this is way more potent and way more addictive than what you or I might think. So, and then the wrong stories about impact are being told, and you talked about politicians. One thing I know about young people is that they will look to their community leaders and the decisions they make to influence their own behavior. So if they see doctors who are out there saying this is a medicine, it's going to influence how bad can it be, right? Of course, we could relate that to opioids, and not all medicines are safe, as we well know. If they see their mayor of their town that said, this is not a big deal, we're going to let a business come in, that's going to impact somewhere, some teen, and the choice they make, right? So when we have community leaders that are valuing things other than youth, because we can all agree, typically, even the marijuana industry, that to some extent that youth shouldn't be using marijuana and that are more prone to addiction, right? So I think when we have communities and community leaders that value something over youth use, or something over the health of youth, then communities have shifted, and that's what we've seen, unfortunately. Yeah. So the way out, I didn't answer the way out. I'm going to leave that to you. That's the hard part.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really, it's a sticky wicket. So one of the things that's very interesting about this, I think, is that when you talk about what are the influences of society. So there was a study that came out recently, one of the first I've seen, that really did a before and after snapshot of communities after recreational dispensaries came in on youth use. And that had been, we don't have much data, it's new, but it absolutely showed that youth use increased. And we'd seen actually some similar things about exposure to marijuana advertising, which of course here in Illinois we allow. Same thing to a lesser extent with the presence of the medical marijuana, quote unquote, dispensaries. I usually like to call it therapeutic uses for cannabinoids, which there are some. I mean, if we're being honest about it, right? It's not that there's none, but the industry is actually very different. And just as a quick aside on this as well, I'm actually going to be doing a couple of webinars in conjunction with GW Pharmaceuticals, who are the people who make cannabinoid-based pharmaceuticals that have gone through the FDA, who are actually, of course, very opposed to the medical marijuana industry, because they're the ones playing by the rules and actually going through the FDA and creating a product that's validated for what it's used for.
Right. And there are a number of those products out there that actually have clinical efficacy, right? I mean, so yeah, right.
Yeah, it's like let's play by the rules. But I remember doing an assembly where I actually had a kid. I appreciated their bravery in saying this, even if it was very misguided. But they said, "How can this be so bad if it cures cancer?" And it was one of those things where there's just so many layers about like what has failed to allow this to occur, where someone feels that something that actually is carcinogenic. And yes, there was one trial that showed for one type of cancer reduced cell growth, which is not exactly the same as curing cancer, but there it is, and so that's what we're working with in youth prevention right now. It's extremely challenging. I think, for me, what's the path forward is, again, a really tough nut to crack, because I think it really depends on the approach of the kid. There's some kids where you could talk about the impact on the developing brain and they care about their body, they care about their brain, they respond to that. There's others that will just outright dismiss that sort of information, or they'll minimize the risk and say, well, I'm not doing that much anyway, so it must be fine. It's tough. You have to tailor your message.
Yeah, and I think part of the way out too is to make sure that we are truly understanding the impact and telling the right story about it. Because one thing that I heard even recently that given the work I do really annoyed me is that I heard marijuana was legalized in Illinois January 1st, 2020, and since then we've had less fatal or cannabis-related car accidents on the road. Okay, that's actually true. I can acknowledge that. Let's look at the context behind it. What's the percentage of less vehicles on the road because of COVID and quarantine and all those things? And it was significantly less, right? So the data didn't correlate. They happened to be less and less, but there were still more by total per capita car, right? But you oftentimes hear the first side of that data, not the second. So we've got to continually ask questions. The same thing about youth use is, people will say that youth use has gone down since marijuana was legalized. And if you look at the SAMHSA National Survey for Drug Use and Health, which is the one we tend to go to for that, sure, there was a slight percentage point reduction in Denver from 2016 to 18 or 18 to 20, I can't remember which one, in marijuana use among 12 to 17-year-olds. However, you take out the fact that it had become so bad that many of the school districts, including Denver schools, pulled out of that study. And there was only about a 20%, rate from some of the areas that were more rural where there weren't dispensaries. So it's like, there is a story to be told there. You can't just look at the black and white. And our side gets guilty of that too, just using data to tell our story. What we have to do is work together to make sure that we are truly understanding the impact using scientific methods, and that we're sharing the story of that impact correctly. Because the reality is that, two most abused substances in the United States or in the world outside of caffeine are alcohol and tobacco, both legal. Like, why would we think marijuana is not going to follow that suit? I think we'd all agree that, I think we'd all agree that alcohol and tobacco have not been good for public health, right? And assuming that marijuana is going to be the outlier there is a little ignorant, I think. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we just need to go into it being honest about the pact that we're making, right? We're saying we're going to value some amount of money over health, and there's going to be fallout about that. But that's, unfortunately, people aren't being straightforward about that, or maybe either they're lying to us or they're lying to themselves about the fact that it's not going to turn out that way, and it gets us into a bind. But before we're out of time, I want to make sure we talk as well about another aspect that's right up your alley, which is about what sort of communities, environmental strategies can we use to help kids navigate this really tricky social ecosystem with all of these potential pitfalls around them? What can we do as parents to help them with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as parents in our homes, I think we've hit on a couple of them. It's talk early and often. It's go to bat for your kid. Be the bat. Make the decision for them. In some cases, they don't have to be the one. Let them blame you for their choice. Or whatever. I think keep kid-friendly activities kid-friendly. That goes for a community in general. We don't need a cooler of beer at the birthday party at 10 a.m. We don't need huge alcohol trucks at Halloween and things like that. So I think there's things that happen in communities that one little tweak here and there could make a big difference. I think it's important that we send a clear no use message. That's both in our homes, but also as a community, so that the community and school and parents are all aligned. So, we're going to be a community that doesn't tolerate underage drinking. If that's a value that we have, decisions we make and ordinances in our community and messaging in our community has to, and public festivals and events have to reflect that value, right? And that's something we get. We'll see proclamations made at city council meetings that say we're going to deem this Red Ribbon Week in honor of the fact that we don't think that alcohol should be something teens use, but then we make it easy to get teens exposed by things that happen in the community. So, and I think a big one that we miss sometimes, and I say this because as a school board member too, up in my local community, is we have to advocate for prevention and mental health support in our schools, because there are too many schools that are understaffed and under-resourced in this area. Too many schools that don't have enough social work people, too many schools that don't have student assistance program coordinators that work in prevention in high schools, too many schools that just don't have the resources they need. And the reality is we have kids struggling, we have teens struggling more than they ever have. We're going to see the impacts of the pandemic for years beyond when we come out on the other side of it. And we have to have our teams ready. We have to value that the same way we value the rest of academics and things like that. We have to, as parents, as community leaders, as advocates, advocate for those things, because that's going to be part of the solution. And right now it's completely under-resourced. So there's a few. I know we could talk about that a long time, Aaron, but there's a few.
Yeah. Well, I'll react to that, and then I want to toss one more question your way before we call it a day that I'm very interested in your take on. But I think what this really underscores for me is that it is so important that we don't dismiss our own messaging, both collectively and individually. That it really makes a difference. That it rolls down to kids, and that if we let it be more of a bottom-up thing, where we let the kids decide their own culture based on the messages they're receiving from industry or from media, that actually is potentially taking their destiny and putting it in the hands of actors who might not actually have their best interests in mind.
Right.
But that being said, I have one more question I would love your take on, because this is something that gets asked of me a lot. And I, as a prevention expert, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So another element of parenting that I think a lot of parents overlook is the power of reinforcement and not just punishment. We talk a lot about setting boundaries and about consequences and what we're tolerating and what we don't. And all of that is important 100%. And at the end of the day, a lot of times the reason why kids engage in these behaviors is they're getting something out of it. There's something, even if it's short term, even if it might be misguided in some way, they're getting benefit or they wouldn't do it. And so when thinking about how do we change behavior, how do we say get a teenager to stop hanging out with friends who are engaging in this sort of behavior or doing other unhealthy things, how do we get them to want to do more pro-social healthy behavior? Are there any tips or any things that you talk to parents about a lot around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can answer that, so, excuse me, from an individual perspective and from an environmental perspective. And by answering it, I mean, I think I can share some things that I've heard have worked for other people. I think one is, it's just from a kind of 30,000 foot view, is, again, I mentioned this before, but focus on the positive reasons for non-use. So, one thing that I've done with students in the classroom is, just, it's a fun little exercise. You can do a family dinner. Take a piece of paper, split it in half. On the left-hand side, write all the reasons why somebody, you or your peers might choose to drink, or use drugs or whatever. And you'll get a lot of short-term stuff. You'll be like to cope with anxiety, to look cool, to fit in, to, any number of things. to get high. On the right side, list all the reasons why, you would choose to avoid that behavior, and you'll get more forward focused things. So you'll get to a good school, don't want to get in trouble, you don't want to hurt the relationship with my parents, so focusing on those decisions that make a longer term outcome. Teens are smart enough to do that. And I think also that, but beyond that, I think, your kids and what they respond to. So, depending on their age, incentivizing things like they get a later curfew if they're, first of all, paying attention, so paying attention and not just assuming that all is well and good because you haven't found them with a vape, making sure that you're vigilant and paying attention and that they are truly making good choices. I've met many parents who are sure their kids were not drinking and their kids had been drinking a long time. Right. So not saying that's you, but it does happen. But when you have students make the right choice, maybe a later curfew, maybe it's a higher allowance, maybe it's, more screen time, which is big for my young kids. Maybe it's, money for college. My sister, who's younger than me, but has kids older than I do, has told her kids that if they graduate, if they get all the way through high school and college, now that's beyond the legal drinking age of 21. If they get all the way, she will give them $5,000 on the day they graduate. So for my nephew, who's in high school, that has seemed to, that's not the only reason, but that has seemed to work, right? That now, I don't know what $5,000 will be by the time my kids graduate from college, or what that'll be equated to now. But I do think that
they'll basically get you a hamburger at Portillo's is what that is.
Probably by then, right? But whatever works, whatever works, I think. And I think also us being willing in so doing those things that we're also willing to make the same choices. So if that you have a teen who doesn't just want to see you drinking, even though you can do it responsibly and you're of age to do it, then maybe not doing that when they're around, if that's part of it, and mm-hmm. encouraging and validating, their choice by your own. And I think that that's not going to work for everybody, but I think us being willing to change our own language and behavior, setting the proper expectations, and then finding something that's going to really work with your kid on an individual basis, makes a lot of sense, because teens do respond better to positive things than negative consequences, for sure.
Those all sound like really great approaches, and thank you for sharing them. I know that it's this principle for me where you have to give someone an alternative that actually seems like it would be workable, because mm-hmm. otherwise, they're going to be 18 at some point. They're going to be out of the house at some point. They've got to want to be different, not just want to avoid punishment, or I feel like any change is short-lived. But that being said, we are almost out of time. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we call it a day?
No, I just think thanks for having the opportunity to be in front of you today. And we're golead.co. That's our website. If you have anything, you can get a hold of me or anybody on my team there. But we'd love to help you out whatever we can. I appreciate the work you do, Dr. Weiner, and thanks for having us on today.
Oh my gosh, of course. And thank you for coming. If you'd like to reach out to me, viewers, you're always welcome to do so as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Until then, take care and be well. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.